Hello, I am Jyotika. Welcome to 𝗧𝗨𝗜𝗧𝗍𝗠𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧𝗧 psychology specialization. The study is the one by Kardes et al. It's been a popular study in past papers, and this is the DTR study, as it would be popularly referred to, the DTR, or the disrupt then reframe technique study. So that's what we're going to learn today. I'm going to be teaching to you this study according to the format prescribed in the syllabus for the AS level. There's no doubt that at the A levels you need to know only summaries of studies, you need not know them in much depth. But that does not mean that you do not organize those studies. The reasons why students find paper 3 and particularly paper 4 very difficult is because they just read and reread through summaries that are presented in their course companions. They do not attempt to organize those summaries in any way. So this lesson today, you can take it for learning your disrupt then reframe study, as well as you can take it as an example of how you should be approaching any study in any specialization at your A levels, how you should be organizing the study. If you're not going to organize the study while preparing, then number one, what are you doing while preparing? Reading and rereading cannot be called as preparation for the examination. Secondly, when you're writing the paper, suddenly the summary that you've learned is not going to become organized in your mind. While preparing for the paper, that is when you have to organize the study. Okay, so this is how you should be learning studies in your paper. In today's class, I am going to describe the study. I'm going to go through a description or an explanation of the study. I will be looking at individual elements of the study, and I'll also make an overview of an evaluation of all the elements. But as concerns issues and debates and evaluation of the research method used, and also a discussion of some possible questions from this study, I will do that in another video. So today's class is about the explanation of the Kardes et al. Study, along with you can take it as an example of how to prepare for your A levels. So let's begin. First, we always begin any study by noting the psychology that was being investigated in the study. So if you have the summary of the study in front of you, you read through it, and then you begin organizing the study in your notebook. The first heading you note down in your notebook is the psychology being investigated. Now, what are we noting when we are talking about the psychology being investigated? We are noting down which aspect of the human mind or behavior was studied in the given study. Which aspect of the human mind or behavior was explored in the given study? That is the question we are answering. We are talking about consumer psychology. Definitely it's going to be some aspect of the mind or behavior that is relevant to consumption of some product or service. So no doubt about that, but exactly which element, which aspect, that is what we need to note down. Now, some idea of the psychology being investigated you get in your syllabus itself. So like in the syllabus we see the heading given for this study in the syllabus is selling the product using interpersonal influence techniques. So this study was about selling a product. So the behavior, human behavior being measured is definitely whether a person is going to buy a product or not. Okay, so the behavior of buying or purchasing is being studied here, as is the case with many studies of consumer psychology. And specifically in which context? In using interpersonal influence techniques. Interpersonal influence techniques, or what we normally refer to as persuasion techniques. When one person persuades the other to buy a certain product or a service. So there are many persuasion techniques. You must have heard of some of the examples: foot in the door, door in the face, right? You must have experienced them yourself. You might have some friends who ask you for notes. How do they ask you for notes? First, they ask you for a little help in some difficulty that they are having. So they ask you for some notes that you jotted down as your teacher was teaching, and you give, and they were absent or they were absent-minded during the class, so you just give them those notes. You're obliged to their request, and then they make their true request, which is they ask you for your entire notes, the entire notes you had noted down throughout the season, throughout your classes. Because what your friends do with you is first they ask you for some notes that you noted down in one particular class, and then they ask you for all the notes that you had been noting down throughout the classes. This is a typical example of foot in the door technique. Okay, so what your friends do with you is first they make a small request, make you oblige towards them, make you feel a sense of duty towards them, and once they've accomplished that, then they ask you for all of your notes. So this is one way in which your friends persuade you. Even when you go for shopping, at that time salesmen can use this foot in the door technique with you. First they'll offer to you something at a discounted price, and so you feel grateful towards them, you feel obliged towards their store because they have done something for you, they have made a special consideration for you. And once you've done that, they sell you the actual product they wanted to sell you at normal prices without any discount. In fact, they might sell it to you with a little higher profit margin. Why? Because they know you are obliged and they're going to take advantage of that sense of obligation. So this is the most typical example, the foot in the door technique, which is one technique of persuasion or interpersonal influence. Now that is used a lot in consumer psychology, right? So this study which we are looking at here, it's not about foot in the door, it's about a different technique, but the overarching theme of this study is how interpersonal influence techniques or persuasion techniques are used to sell products. So what the people who formulated your syllabus decided is that you should be knowing about this area of consumer psychology, about how persuasion or interpersonal influence techniques are used to sell off products to consumers. And so as the best example for this theme, they found the study by Kardes et al. So the psychology being investigated in this study is whether people are more likely to buy something if they have sold that product with the use of some interpersonal influence technique. When we are noting down what the psychology is being investigated in a particular study, we need to come down more specifically to exactly what was being investigated. So just what is given in the syllabus is not enough. With respect to the study given to us, specific to the study given to us, we have to note down what psychology was being investigated. So specific to the Kardes et al. Study, the psychology being investigated was whether a consumer is more likely to buy a product or purchase a product if the disrupt then reframe technique of interpersonal influence is used with that consumer. So this was the psychology being investigated. Okay, and now once we know what the theme is, in other words what the psychology being investigated is, we proceed with why the study was conducted in the first place. So the next thing we need to note down is the background to the study. Background to the study just means what were the gaps in literature that the psychologists sought to fill through with the help of their study. Now when it comes to any idea or theme that psychologists have conceptualized, what we technically call a research question. So in this case, Kardes et al. Wanted to know the effectiveness of DTR in making sales. In that case, obviously any researcher, once he knows what he wants to study, is going to look at what the current state of research in that area is. So he is going to note how much research has already been done in the case of disrupt and reframe, and what is left desirable that he can contribute to as a researcher, right? Because if studies have already been done around the exact idea that he has in his mind, it would be a waste of time and resources to repeat those studies. Wouldn't it be much better to identify what is missing in past studies and then contribute in those areas? That's what any researcher does. That is the method followed in performing research. So that is what Kardes et al. Did as well. Once they decided that they want to look into the DTR technique of making sales, they made a review of literature, existing studies in psychology around this technique, and then they identified some gaps that we are going to look into now, which is why they conducted their study in a particular manner, which we will see further. Okay, so coming to the background of the study, what Kardes et al. Noted was that yes, there had been a lot of studies on persuasion techniques or interpersonal techniques of influence, such as, like I gave you the example, foot in the door, door in the face, such type of techniques, anchoring techniques. Nevertheless, these studies had not been conducted in commercial settings. The kind of studies that had been done using these techniques had been done with students largely, that too with the case of non-monetary compliance. Okay, so students had been persuaded in these studies, but not for the sake of purchasing products. They had been persuaded into things like changing their opinions on some controversial topics. Okay, so the researchers felt that these studies have definitely looked into interpersonal influence, which is a big area in social psychology, but they had not narrowed down the use of interpersonal influence techniques to consumer psychology, because consumer psychology is dominated by making sales, and these studies are not looked into whether really sales can be made by the use of interpersonal influence techniques. And the samples that had been used, those of students, were very restrictive in nature. Okay, because consumers come from all categories. Only students are not consumers. There are a lot of consumers out there, non-student consumers. So the researchers felt there's a need to look into that population as well, that of non-students, as well as they felt that there was a need to look into monetary compliance or agreement, simply stating agreement to purchase products if interpersonal techniques of influence were used with people. So that is what they came down to, and that is what they wanted to study. This is the gap they identified in literature. This was what was missing in past studies, and they sought to fulfill this gap with their present study. Besides that, the researchers also explained to us what DTR is, how it has been conceptualized right at the beginning, and this is very important for us from an exam point of view as well, because certain concepts, they ask you for the meaning. So for this study, they're going to ask you what DTR means, what is the disrupt then reframe technique, what NFCC means, what perceived ambiguity means. These are the main concepts in this study. So you need to know about them, and the best way to know about any concept is to look at the research paper itself and see how it has been conceptualized in that paper. So how the present researchers have looked in the technique. So we've been talking a lot about persuasion techniques, and let's understand for now properly what are the definition of persuasion techniques and what is the specific technique of persuasion which is called disrupt and reframe. Beginning with persuasion techniques, what does it mean to persuade someone? It's just to motivate or convince someone to do something, to comply to a request, right? So social psychology, which is about people interacting with each other, which is about interpersonal influences, is a lot about is filled with research on these persuasion techniques. Social psychologists have long understood the importance of persuasion in everyday relationships. So as the researchers also noted that there have been a lot of studies in everyday life when it comes to interpersonal influence. We all have a lot of requests we want to make to other people. We have a lot of expectations from other people, so definitely we want them to comply with us, and so we do use a lot of techniques, knowingly or unknowingly, to persuade other people. So social psychologists have really studied these techniques. One such technique that they have studied is the DTR, disrupt and reframe technique. This is not one of those techniques that we use in everyday life. This is a strategically designed technique to persuade other people, which has been formulated in an attempt to, as we will see further, to reduce the amount of counter arguing that a person engages in when he knows he is going to be persuaded. One thing is persuading other people. We all like to persuade others, convince them of something we would like them to do for us. At the other end, none of us like to be persuaded. It's a feeling of manipulation that we do not enjoy. Okay, so I would not like to know that I have been persuaded by someone. I would rather believe I exert my free will when it comes to making decisions or choices, right? So I do not like to be persuaded. This is the case with most people. They do not like to be persuaded by others. So the moment we know we are going to be persuaded by someone is making a persuasion attempt on us, our immediate reaction is to try to defend ourselves psychologically. So what we do is we build some counter arguments in our mind as to why we should reject the request that this person is making to us. A simple example of this is, if you enter a shop, the salesman is going to try and sell more products to you than you intend to buy, than the ones you have gone in to buy in the first place, right? He's going to try to sell a lot of products to you. That is something you expect. So this is a request that is going to come to your way of buying many products that you do not wish to. So your mind is prepared, your mind is already expecting that a lot of requests are going to be put to you. So what your mind does to defend itself against such persuasion is, it prepares some counter arguments, it prepares some resistance which will prevent you from flowing into the request of another person, or from giving into the persuasion that the other person is performing on you. So in that case, what your mind does is, it prepares some arguments such as, I should not be wasting my money, it is better if I just buy what I intend to buy, and simply not look further into what someone is trying to sell to me. So I should cut short the salesman as soon as possible if I want to protect myself against the requests he's making to me. I should not listen to the details of any plans or any policies or any product descriptions that he's putting in front of me. This is how your mind prepares you in a situation in which it is expecting certain requests to come on the way. So what we need to understand is, people do like to persuade us, but our mind is resistant to persuasion. We do not like to be persuaded. For consumer psychologists who are searching for techniques to make highest amount of sales, make lot of sales, this is a big obstacle in their path, that people are not going to be easily persuaded, that people are going to show resistance towards persuasion. So they have started formulating techniques which can break through this resistance to persuasion, and one such technique they have come up with is disrupt then reframe. As you can see here itself, disrupt then reframe is meant to reduce counter-arguing to people, counter-arguing inside people, and to increase their susceptibility to reframing. So we'll understand this technique now. What is the meaning of disrupt then reframe? As originally conceptualized, disruption refers to a disruption in the traditional script of making a request. Okay, normally how do you request for something? You request for something with a lot of clarity. You request for something very straightforward, so as to not waste the other person's time, and to make it very clearly known to him what exactly it is that you want. This is what we would consider as a traditional means of requesting something. Now, disrupting this traditional means, what would that be? Confusing the other person, removing the clarity from the request being given to them, and presenting things in a rather unclear manner. So this disruption of the traditional means of selling something, which would break the counter arguing that a person is likely to do, break the resistance inside him, and then reframing what we want to request in a clear fashion, what we should have presented in the first place. So if we take the original experiment, the seminal work on DTR, that will make it easier to understand what this technique is all about. In this seminal work, the original work on DTR, what the researchers did was, the researchers who actually framed this technique, who conceptualized this technique, they did an experiment with several participants whom they wanted to sell note cards to. How they sold these note cards to them, how they requested them to buy these note cards was rather unusual. So what they did was, they presented the note cards to their participants, and they treated the participants in two different ways. So we can imagine they created two groups of participants for their study. To one group of participants, they made a direct request, what we normally do. So they asked them, please purchase these note cards for $3. Okay. So what they found, they noted down how many percentage, what percentage of the participants they approached in this manner with the direct request actually purchased the note cards. So the purchasing of the note cards was their measured variable. To another group of participants, they presented the request indirectly in an ambiguous manner, unclear fashion, which was a break from the traditional direct request. To this group of participants, they asked, please buy these note cards for 300 pennies. Now that's a very peculiar way of phrasing the price of the note cards, but they did it intentionally. And after making this request that please purchase these note cards for 300 pennies, they took a 2-second break and then told the participants, oh, which amounts to $3. Okay, so then they did come down to the direct message, but first they presented the message in a peculiar manner, in a disruptive manner, and then only did they come down to the direct request format. What they found was, when they noted the percentage of people with whom this technique was used, for purchasing the product, the note cards, the percentage of the people who purchased the note card in this condition was much higher than those, in fact it was significantly higher than the percentage of people who purchased the note card in the case of when a direct request was made to them. So the DTR technique had been successful in its original experiment. The question then arose of why this technique works. How does it manage to break resistance? What is the means by which it breaks resistance? Why is it so effective? How come it increases sales to a significant extent? This is what has been explained in the background of this study as well. First, we have understood what is disrupt, then rephrase. We disrupt the traditional direct request format, and then we rephrase to the direct request format, and that is how we make a request to the consumer. Milton Erickson, a very famous name in psychology for his therapy, he used to use this technique a lot. He didn't call it in those terms, disrupt then reframe, but he used to use it with his patients for therapy with whom he used to use hypnosis. He used to use this technique, and he explained why this technique works. He wanted to hypnotize his patients. His means of solving his patients' problems was to hypnotize them and then give them therapy under the influence of hypnosis. What would happen is what happens in the case of sales. His patients wanted to be hypnotized because they knew that would benefit them, that would help them solve their problems. They could get therapy for their problems by being hypnotized, but at the same time they felt a lot of resistance to the hypnosis he was going to perform on them, because they had not heard very good things about hypnosis. They didn't like that feeling that they were suggestible, that they were vulnerable to someone hypnotizing them, so they had resistance. And Erickson wanted to break the resistance within them, because he knew that hypnosis would fail if the patients would continue to be resistant. So what he would do was, he would initially present some disruptive messages to them. So normally how hypnosis is done is people are put in a very sleepy, dizzy condition. Okay, so they are asked to follow some pendulum with their eyes, something like that, when hypnosis is done, and to drop their defenses, basically. That is what is done. Erickson, instead of dropping their defenses, would give them some disruptive messages. What he found was, when he gave them those disruptive messages, their attention would be so occupied with those messages that whatever counter arguments they were making in their mind, that I'm not suggestible, I shouldn't be given into hypnosis, I shouldn't accept the messages coming to me, their attention would be deviated from such thoughts. Their resistance would thereby decrease, because their attention was no longer on their resistance, and this in fact increased their susceptibility to hypnosis more than ever before. Okay, because all the counter arguments had just come to an end. What this would mean for sales is, people are coming into the sales to the shop with the resistance in their mind, with counter arguments that I don't want to spend unnecessarily. Salesmen are going to sell things, they are going to make tall claims, they are going to make products look very appealing. So these are the kind of counter arguments they come with, and I'm not to give in to all these attempts by the salesmen. Once we disrupt them, so once we present something unusual, like would you buy this card for 300 pennies, all their attention is drawn away from their counter arguments, and now what they're trying to comprehend is, what is 300 pennies, what is he trying to say, what is 300 pennies amount, and why is he speaking this way? So suddenly there's a new surge of thoughts in the person's mind, and as we will see further in this study, which creates a lot of confusion in the mind. So is this a good offer or not? Because we normally don't hear an offer in terms of 300 pennies. We are confused whether this is a good deal or not. So we are given 2 seconds to get confused. We are purposely put into confusion for 2 seconds, and then the confusion is cleared out once our attention is taken away from our original resistance. And then we are told, okay, this is a $3 card, so do you want to buy it? So what happens in the process is, our attention has come out from the counter arguments. We feel relieved that the confusion created, which was artificially created deliberately, but we do not realize that. So we are happy the confusion is cleared, and we feel, yes, this is a good offer. So right now I was thinking, is this a good offer or not? And now right now I have been told, okay, this is a good offer, and so I buy the card which is given to me. This is how the disrupt then reframe technique works out. And this is the Ericksonian principle of using disrupt and reframe, which is found to be one of the best explanations for why the method works. 𝗬𝗎s et al. Have shown something similar in their past research. 𝗬𝗎s is one of the authors of the present research. In their past research also, they had studied the disrupt and reframe technique in other settings. In that, what they had proposed was why disrupt and reframe works is because it decreases the ability of people to generate counter arguments. So not only the counter arguments they come into the showroom or to the shop with, are put to an end because their attention is deviated into the disrupted format of making a request, but also the ability to generate further counter arguments comes to an end because their resources become depleted. Their mental resources, or simply saying their thinking power, gets depleted in the process of trying to figure out what is being told to them. When they're put into confusion and they're trying to comprehend and straighten out the message in their mind, their resources are so consumed that they do not have the ability to further counter argue with the request which is being made to them, and we know the direct request is going to follow. So by the time the direct request comes to them, their ability to go on arguing and their ability to go on resisting has been put to an end. That's what 𝗬𝗎s et al. Proposed, and the present researchers agreed with it. There are many ways of creating disruption. We just saw the original work, the original paradigm, which is presenting the amount of the request being made in a very unusual format, such as 300 pennies. But that's just one of the ways of creating disruption in a traditional way of making requests. There are many other ways. Nonetheless, in the present study, the traditional paradigm has been used. The authors have just noted that other things can be done as well, and they are done as well, to disrupt our attention when we go to buy something, and then to convince us to buy that product. For example, they have noted that salesmen might use unusual speech patterns. They might use non sequiturs, unusual face and motor movements, or very commonly what they use, technical jargon. They might use technical jargon to disrupt the traditional way of making requests, and then present the requests in an easy to understand everyday manner, everyday language, which would make us more susceptible to following and complying with their request. Okay, so you might have visited showrooms, especially if you've gone to buy gadgets. You might have seen that salesmen, instead of telling you directly, for instance, what the memory capacity of a phone is, they might use terminology like gigabytes or tetrabytes, which you are not very familiar with. Okay, so first you go with the resistance in your mind that the features of the phone are not very good, which you're going to buy, and then the salesman lists out a lot of technical features which are there, which are not easy for you to understand. Nevertheless, he presents the mobile phone instead of using a direct request for you to buy the phone and just saying it's good, it has good memory, it has good audio, it has good visuals, good screen resolution. Instead of using such terminology, he tells you something very technical. So suddenly you are busy trying to figure out what he's trying to tell you, what all these words mean, the gigabytes, tetrabytes, or the pixels, and the per density pixels, or some language which he's using like that, and you don't understand what he's saying. And when you're so busy trying to figure out whether it's a good mobile after all or not, given the information that he's giving you about the phone, that is when he takes advantage of the situation and he translates it into a direct request, which he should have presented in the first place. So what he tells you is it's a very good phone with a lot of memory and a very good screen resolution, and then suddenly, because you've dropped all your defenses, you've dropped all your resistance, you are now ready to buy the phone. So this is found to be done very commonly when it comes to technical type of products. Okay, nonetheless, the researchers in the present context wanted to see whether it can be used in other commercial settings as well, and whether this original paradigm of presenting a request in terms of money in a very unusual format would work out in making good product sales. For this purpose, the researchers conducted 3 experiments, as we will see further, but there's something more we need to understand in the background before proceeding. One concept which we have just understood is DTR, what it is and why it works, and they can ask you in the paper for it. Another thing, they can ask you what is NFCC. The researchers in the present study, they wanted not only to study the DTR, they wanted to give a kind of a theoretical interpretation to why it works, why the DTR technique works. So they did not simply want to confirm its effectiveness in different settings. They also wanted to provide an explanation of what makes DTR work. For this, they used moderation and mediation in their analysis. Beginning with moderation, they proposed that NFCC, or the need for cognitive closure, is what moderates the relationship between the use of the DTR technique and compliance to a request. What is moderation? Moderation just means that the relationship between two variables is contingent or dependent on the third variable. So what it meant here was, the variables we have is the DTR technique, use of it or no use of it, and we have compliance with the request, which is being made either in the DTR format or not. Whether a person will agree to a request that has been made using the DTR technique depends on whether he has a need for cognitive closure or not. Most people do have a need for closure, cognitive closure, or need for closure as we would call it. Either they are high on this need or they are low on it. So they do have the need, but some people have very less of this need and some have a lot of this need. So how much of an impact DTR is going to have, the use of DTR is going to have on a person, depends on whether he's high on the need for cognitive closure or whether he's low on the need. Now, what do we mean by need for cognitive closure? What do we mean by closure? Closure just means that we want a resolution to something, right? Need for cognitive closure means cognitive, loosely we can understand as thinking. It involves a lot of things. We might be decoding a lot of things in our mind, solving problems, making decisions. All of this is the cognition we perform. So in a sales context, what it means is, if I'm a customer or a consumer and some request is being put to me, I engage in a lot of cognitive processing at that point. Even before entering the sales, the shop, the showroom, I am engaging in a lot of thoughts related to that product, and when a request is being put to me, I engage again in a lot of thoughts. Now, someone who needs cognitive closure, need is a strong word. So someone who needs cognitive closure is very uncomfortable till all the thinking, all the cognitive processing he's engaging in comes to a resolution point. Till all his thinking brings him to a decision or to a solution, he feels very uncomfortable. Need shows his motivation or his active desire for a resolution of all his thinking. He cannot let his thinking go waste. He cannot let his thinking be all over the place. He needs his thinking to converge at some point. That is a person who has a high need for cognitive closure. Simply someone who's uncomfortable with not having his cognitive processes lead to a result. And someone who's low on the need for cognitive closure is the opposite. He is okay with, he is not uncomfortable with having to engage in cognitive processing, and leaving the processes incomplete for a while. He's okay with that. He's open in that sense. Okay, so a lot of people are identified as being high on the need for cognitive closure, not only in the consumer context but in many contexts of interpersonal relationships. There are a lot of people who need their thinking to come to a resolution. What these researchers in the present study, Kardes et al. Proposed was that DTR technique is going to be effective with those people who are high on the need for cognitive closure rather than those who are low on this need. So whether DTR will work out in having people buy products is dependent on whether these people have a need for cognitive closure or not. That is what the researchers proposed. If they do not have this need, in the sense they are low on this need, in that case DTR will not work out for them. Okay, so what the researchers did, like I told you, they wanted to explain why the DTR works. So this was their first proposal. Why it works is because among those who have this high NFCC, it provides a resolution to their thinking. That is how it works. So there's something to do with the personality of the person that makes DTR work with him. Okay, so what happens in the course of DTR is, there is someone, you can imagine if I'm a person who's high on NFCC, high on the need for closure, and I enter a shop and then I'm presented with a request which is presented in very vague terms, difficult to understand terms, immediately my cognitive processes are going to start working. I'm going to start evaluating what is being presented to me. That is, I'm going to start thinking a lot. Once I start thinking, I'm a person who needs closure, so I need that my thinking should come to a resolution, and then within a very brief period of time, within 2 seconds, I'm given the closure which I need. Okay, so the sales pitch or the request has been rephrased in a way which helps me come to a decision, which helps me decide, okay, this product is good, and that means my cognitive processes get resolved. So all the time that I'm thinking, is it good, is it not good, should I buy, shouldn't buy, and now the request has been rephrased in a way that I can quickly come to the decision, yes, I should buy, it's a very good product. So because that reframing part of the disrupt then reframe, the reframing part helps me to close my cognitive processes, helps me come to a closure. That is why I am willing to buy the product. So this is the moderation of the relationship which the researchers presented, and this is what we mean by need for cognitive closure. Another thing the researchers proposed was that perceived ambiguity mediates the relationship between DTR and compliance to the request. Okay, before moving to this, there's something more about the NFCC that I need to mention. Need for cognitive closure, as I told you, is applicable to various situations. In fact, it is applicable to many type of consumer behaviors also. When it comes to purchasing products, someone who's high on NFCC is susceptible to a lot of techniques, as evidenced by past research. So what Kardes et al. Found was there hadn't been research on whether the DTR works interplays with the NFCC and gets people to buy products, but other similar work had been done. So it had been found that people who have NFCC, for instance, they are easily susceptible to the primacy effect, and then they do make product purchases based on the primacy effect. So if people are made requests to, and their thinking is going on an overdrive, and they really need to close down that thinking, they need to come to a closure, in that case for instance, if we take the primacy effect, they will purchase the product that first comes to their mind, that they had been exposed to first in a sales situation, because primacy effect just means that something that had been shown in the beginning is present in long-term memory, so it can be retrieved easily. So people who have high NFCC, they have shown susceptibility to things like the primacy effect. Simply they're so desperate, as we would say, to come to a closure or to bring their cognitive processes to resolution, that they'll buy the first products that they can remember were told to them that were good, which come to their mind. Okay, so similar results have been found by using persuasion techniques involving stereotyping and anchoring. NFCC people are susceptible to a lot of interpersonal influence techniques, and what the researchers therefore wanted to establish, Kardes et al., was that they will also be susceptible to the disrupt then reframe technique. Besides that, they also proposed that the relationship between DTR and compliance to the request is mediated by perceived ambiguity. What do we mean by mediated? Mediation just means that when we have two variables, one here being DTR, the other being compliance to a request, there is some variable in between, mediation, something intermediate, something in between, which this variable first influences, and then that variable influences the other variable. So something that's then between these two, between this relationship. So what was assumed was that DTR, using disrupt then reframe, would first influence how much ambiguity people perceive in the situation and then take them towards complying to a request or not. That is, DTR does not directly influence whether a person complies with the request or not. Rather, it influences how much ambiguity or lack of clarity a person perceives, that is, he feels personally in a situation, and then that determines whether he would oblige to request or not. If DTR is successful in increasing ambiguity, what is believed is, in that case, because of the increase in ambiguity, people will be more likely to comply to the request. It's as if I go to a sales showroom, and because of the way the person is making a request, that increases my lack of clarity so much. I become so unclear with whether the product is worth buying or not. that when he reframes his request, I suddenly feel the clarity has come in and all the lack of clarity has dissipated, and now I'm willing to buy the product. Again, this would be moderated by the NFCC. It would depend on whether I have a high need for closure or not. So, to summarize how this study came about and what is the background of this study, what happens is, when requests are made indirectly, when requests are made using a disrupt then reframe, create a confusion and then bring in clarity type of a technique, in that case, for people who have a high need for resolution of their thinking, who have a high need for closure, they perceive some ambiguity when they are disrupted with a confusing message, and when that message is clarified, they feel clarity, they feel that their cognitive processes can now come to a closure, which is why they become more ready to buy a product than if this confusion is not created, then if this disruption of a traditional message is not done. Because in that case, if they are directly made a request to, even if they have a high need for cognitive closure, they themselves can decide, they can quickly bring their cognitive processes to closure themselves by comprehending the message that is given to them. But when they are given a confusing message, that is when they find a difficulty in coming down to cognitive closure. So this is what the researchers proposed, that DTR is going to work with people having high NFCC because it is going to increase the amount of ambiguity they feel initially and then bring down that feeling of ambiguity, make things clear for them, which will make them more likely to comply with the request which is made to them. So this is the background and this is the ideology behind the research work. Now coming down to the studies which were done to tap into the aims. First of all, we have to look at the aims. What were the aims of the researchers? There were 3 aims that the researchers wished to look into directly based on the background that they have presented, the gaps that they had identified in existing work. The first thing the researchers wanted to establish was that the DTR technique, which they had found in past research that it works in many cases with students for non-monetary requests, now with this study they wanted to establish that it can work in commercial context also, in sales environments also, and by actually getting people to spend their money, so it can actually drive purchase of products and services. This is the first thing that they wanted to establish, the most, we can say, the most basic aim that they wanted to showcase through their study. The next thing they wanted to show was the DTR technique would work better in the case of people having high need for cognitive closure. It's not like the DTR technique would not work at all in the case of people not having a high need for cognitive closure, because people do have some extent of the need and it could be working in other ways. So researchers did not deny that, but they said that the results would be more pronounced or most evident in the case of those people who have a high need for closure. We have already seen why they came to this, because they had seen a number of other techniques do work with people who have high need for cognitive closure, and given the nature of this need, they could logically believe, they logically came to the reasoning that DTR would work with such people better. Besides that, they wanted to show that the DTR effect is mediated by perceived ambiguity. They wanted to show that how the DTR technique works is by increasing ambiguity or decreasing the clarity available in the request and then resolving that confusion which has been created for the customer. So they wanted to showcase all these things by means of their research. Again, we saw in the background why perceived ambiguity was considered to be a mediator. Okay, now they presented 3 studies. So the researchers were highly organized. For each of their aims, they presented a different study. All of these are experiments, but the nature or the type of experiments used are different. The first 2 studies are field studies. The third study is a laboratory study. So the researchers conducted 3 experiments, 1 each for each of their respective aims, to test their aims, or what we can call their hypothesis. To test each of their hypotheses, they conducted a separate experiment. Now this is where we really begin with the study. We have understood the ideology behind it. Now we begin with the study, and this is what is going to serve for evaluation further. So we have come now to the methodology part of the research. Okay, here Beginning with experiment 1, what was the paradigm or the general overview of the procedure of this study? We understand that first, and then it becomes easier to understand other elements. So when you're noting down the outline of your summary and you come to this section, the procedure of the study, once you've read the summary, the first thing you should note down is basically what happened in the study. You can imagine in your mind a stepwise procedure of what was done, which we call an experimental paradigm. Experimental paradigm is just the procedure through which the experiment was conducted. In this study, first study, what was done was participants, it was a field experiment, so participants were those who were actually shopping in a supermarket. What was done with people who were actually shopping in a supermarket? A separate sales counter was set up where the researchers, confederates or assistants were selling candy. And now they were going to use the DTR technique to convince people who are actually shopping in the market, in the supermarket, to buy that candy. So for some shoppers, they were going to use the DTR technique to sell the candy. And for some of the shoppers, they were going to make direct requests for purchasing the candy to create a control condition and to compare how much increase in sales or a decrease. The expectation was an increase, so how much an increase in sales could be achieved by using the DTR technique for selling the candy. So this is basically the idea of the experiment. Accordingly, we see a field experiment was used. Field experiment, as you would know, it is an experiment. It is a comparison between two conditions that occurs in natural settings. So definitely people buying, making purchases in supermarket is a realistic scenario. People keep purchasing all the time from supermarkets. So looking into the DTR technique in such a commercial context, which is so everyday life type, so realistic, was a very good idea by the researchers. I'll look into it again when I finish this section and I do an evaluation of each element. As we saw in the intro itself, the researchers told us they wanted to look into non-monetary context. They wanted to work with non-student populations to check the effectiveness of the DTR technique. So we can clearly see what was the logic behind going into a supermarket and trying to sell candy there using DTR. It was all about realism and extension of past studies to actual populations where we could make sales. So that's how they came into the supermarket. The research method was a field experiment. What the researchers hypothesized for this study or for this experiment was that a greater percentage of those to whom the candy was sold using the DTR technique would end up purchasing the candy. Actually not purchasing, but agreeing to purchase the candy. We'll see why I'm using the word agreeing here, as compared to those to whom the same candy was sold without the DTR technique by making a direct request to buy the candy. Okay, so coming down to what are the measured and manipulated variables in this experiment. Manipulated variables, as you would know, are independent variables or predictor variables, and these in the case, because this was an experiment, there was one such variable. It was actively manipulated by the researchers. And this manipulated variable of the study was the way in which the request was framed and presented to the targets whom the researchers wanted should buy the candy. How they requested them, what wording they used, or how they phrased the request was the manipulated variable. As you know, whenever you're making an outline, you should always state the manipulated and measured variables in operational terms. You should be using operational definitions. So in this case, phrasing of the request is the operational definition. If I was to just speak of broadly what was the manipulated variable, I would say use of the DTR technique. So either the DTR technique was used or it wasn't used. But then how was it implemented for this experiment? What was the meaning of using DTR technique in this experiment? That is what answers the question of operationally defining. So in this case, use of DTR meant phrasing the request to buy the candy in particular words. So that is why for this experiment, the measured variable, the manipulated variable or the independent variable would be considered to be the phrasing of the request that was made to the shoppers. Okay, so for some of the shoppers, the request was made in terms of, would you, since the Christmas season is on, would you like to buy this candy for simply 100 euro cents? A 2 seconds pause, and then which means 1 euro. Okay, so again we see that original classical paradigm has been used here. The seminal original work which was done on the DTR technique, the paradigm is directly borrowed from them. So the manipulated variable or the independent variable was phrasing of the request. For half of the participants, or we can say for some of the participants, the request was in the form of the disrupt then rephrase technique. So for those participants, they were first asked to buy candy which would cost them 100 euro cents. 100 euro cents are roughly 100 pennies. And then they were presented the request in a way that normally would have been presented. A direct request, would you buy this candy for 1 euro? What was the expectation here is clear, that first when the terminology 100 euro cents would use, that would confuse the participants, that would disrupt the counter arguments in their mind. You could imagine the shoppers were coming, they could see a special counter for sales of candy, and they had built resistance in their mind. And they had the counter arguments in their mind. Oh, this salesman is going to make the candy look very attractive, he's going to try to sell a lot of candy to me, he's going to show as if he's giving me the best offer. And then comes in this request, would you buy it for 100 euro cents? And the consumer is disrupted in his thought process, and he's trying to figure out whether 100 euro cents is a good offer or not. And within 2 seconds, he's given a closure. He's given the idea that yes, it's just $1, so it's a good offer, it's a good deal. And that is when he agrees, yes, I will buy the product. For the other participants, the remaining participants, what was done was directly they were requested, they were directly told what was the price of the candy, and they were asked whether they would like to buy it or not. Okay, what was the measured variable? Whether the people actually picked up the candy and added it to their shopping cart or not. That was taken operationally as the dependent variable of this experiment. Okay, and this is again, when I evaluate I'll tell you further, but what was done was simply a yes or no. So madam, would you buy the candy? And the madam says yes. That was not taken as an indication that the lady had complied to the request. Whether she actually put the candy into her shopping cart or not was taken as compliance to the request. So broadly, if I had to tell you what was the dependent variable, I would have said it is complying with the request or purchasing the candy. But operationally, what it meant in this study was whether the box of candy was added to the shopping cart or not. That was taken as an indication. So the number of people who actually added the box to their cart was counted, and the number of people who, despite being requested, either using the DTR or directly requested, who did not add the candy to their box, was also noted down, and these numbers were converted into percentages. So even going even deeper into the operational definition, we would say the percentage of people adding the candy to their box was considered to be the dependent variable of this experiment. Okay, if we talk about the experimental design, because this is an experiment, so we should note down the design which was used. It was an independent groups design, because we saw the manipulated or the independent variable was at 2 levels. The phrasing of the request either using DTR or a direct request. A different set of participants were exposed to or were made a request using DTR, and a different set of participants were made a request directly without using the DTR. So definitely it was an independent groups design. In terms of sample and sampling technique, who were the participants of this study? 147 shoppers in the supermarket were participants of the study. Those who stopped by the counter for the sales of candy, those were considered to be participants. Not everybody in the shopping context, so not everybody who was passing near the sales candy or the candy stall or just looking at it, not everybody was considered to be a participant. Only those who actually stopped and listened to the request of the research confederate, only those were considered to be participants. So there were 147 such people, 43 of whom were male and 104 of whom were female. Gender is immaterial to this study, so we can just understand these were people belonging to the general adult population. We can see their age also. The mean age was 46 years with a standard deviation of 14.89. which means that we can say it was quite a diverse group in terms of age. It was the general adult population of, we can say, belonging to all age groups, young adults, middle adults, older adults. It was a variety of population, a good representation of people we typically find in the supermarket. Sampling was as per convenience because the researchers did not randomly select people, as is typical in the case of a field experiment. Those people who naturally stop by the counter for the candy, they were considered to be participants of the experiment. So convenience sample, the researchers had targeted a supermarket which was easy for them to conduct a study in, and then whoever stopped by their counter was taken to be a participant of the study. This is how the study took place. I hope the procedure is clear to you. Then coming to data analysis, logistic regression was used. Logistic regression is used when we have a dichotomous dependent variable. In this case, dependent variable was adding box of candy to the cart. So either a person added the box of candy to his cart or he did not add it. Either or. Dichotomous, when we have dichotomous variables and we want to make predictions, we use logistic regression. I won't speak much more of this here because you're in high school. You don't need to know in too much detail. Just remember, logistic regression was the technique used here. What the results indicated, they used Wald statistics for analysis. Again, I won't go into the detail of it. But what the researchers found was that 65% of people with whom the disrupt then reframe technique was used actually added the candy to their box after the request was made in the DTR format, and only 44% of those to whom a direct request was made without using DTR, who were directly asked, will you buy this box of candy for €1, 44% of such people added the candy to their box. Now, irrespective of whether you feel these figures are different enough, the difference between them is big enough, what we check for always is significance. Whether the results that have been found in this particular study would actually be found in the population of people shopping in a supermarket or not. That helps us determine what is the quality of results of the study. And definitely the difference was found to be significant with a probability level of 0.01. So there was only 1 out of 100 chance of getting this result only in this particular sample. In 99 cases, this is exactly the result we would expect with any shoppers in a supermarket. Okay, so what we learned from this first experiment, we will be seeing conclusions later, but this experiment was directly based on the first hypothesis, which was that DTR will increase compliance with a monetary request in a commercial context, and from the results we can see this was successfully established. People who were made a request to buy candy using the DTR technique, definitely a greater number of those people ended up buying the candy as compared to those who were made a direct request. So the researchers managed to fulfill their first objective. Here there has been no manipulation of NFCC. That will be done in a separate study. Let's evaluate, because what we are asked to do in our syllabus right from the AS levels when we are making outline is to evaluate the strengths and weaknesses of every element of the research methodology. We do consider issues and debates. Like I told you, it will come up in another video. I will be posting that. Issues and debates, research method used, that is a field experiment, and some sample questions. As of now, it is a very good practice to evaluate every element that you have jotted down in your outline before proceeding. That really gives you a frame of mind which you will need to be able to consider the issues and debates next after you're done with the description of the study. So never omit this practice. In fact, do it in writing. Note down the strengths and weaknesses of every element of the study. So starting from the research method employed, it was a field experiment. I will not go into the details of the strengths and weaknesses of using a field experiment, because I am going to make a separate video on the evaluation of the research method used, where I will be going into the detail. As of now, just noting down the main strengths and weaknesses of this method as applies to this study. Always when we evaluate something or when we consider issues and debates, it should be specific to the study at hand. The examiners are not interested in your general knowledge, how much you have mugged up about the strength and weakness of every method. Are you able to apply what you have learned about strengths and weaknesses to the studies given to you? That is key to be able to write good answers. What was the strength and weakness of using a field experiment? How you have to answer this is, what was the strength of using a field experiment in the Kardes et al. Study number 1? What was the weakness of using a field experiment in the Kardes et al. Study number 1? This is how you have to answer. This is the question, how you have to rephrase it in your mind. Not simply what is the strength of using a field experiment, what is the weakness of using a field experiment. No, you're not supposed to give rote learned answers. Okay, what was the strength of using field experiment in this study? The strength was that the researchers could see realism, what we call ecological validity. They could see how really shoppers in a supermarket respond to the use of a DTR technique, how much it really increases their compliance or decreases or changes or keeps it static. They could see all of this in a realistic setting, because a supermarket is a real setting where a lot of purchases are made, where a lot of consumers come in for their daily purchasing behavior. So that was the strength of using this technique. It was the objective with which the researchers had decided to use this technique, and it is the strength, as I told you in details in another video. What was the weakness of using this technique? Lack of control. As we know, when it comes to a field experiment, the researchers had no control over participant variables, which in this case would be how much these shoppers whom they were dealing with in the supermarket, how much they were already likely to comply to requests, how less likely they were to comply. They knew nothing about these shoppers. They had no background information about these shoppers. So if there were some participant variables such as their natural willingness, what we call natural agreeableness, a natural tendency to comply with requests, if it had so happened that to whoever they made the DTR request, those people naturally had a tendency to comply to requests more than those with whom only the reframing technique was used. If such a possibility was present, the researchers had not been able to measure that, because they had not done random assignment of any type, no type of random selection. Neither had they matched participants or even at least looked into their background or made a personality check of theirs before having them exposed to different conditions of their experiment. So that was definitely the case here. Also, they had no control over background variables, even as simple as noise. So whether participants were distracted by other aspects in the supermarket when they were hearing the request of candy being made to them, whether something in the background such as noise or lighting or something was distracting them, the researchers had no control over these things. It could have so happened that only with those who were used, with whom the DTR technique was used, only with those with whom direct requests were made, only those participants were influenced by some background variables or some other things happening in the supermarket which was beyond the control of the researchers. Again, this is something to what extent we can estimate all of this has affected the results of the present experiment, which is not much, but something I will discuss in a more detailed video. This is just to get you thinking and give you an idea of what possibilities are there of strengths and weaknesses of the method used, which is a field experiment. Okay, besides this, if we evaluate, there's nothing to evaluate in hypothesis. If we evaluate the measured and manipulated variables, the way they've been operationalized, speaking of the manipulated variable, it's been operationalized well. The original disrupt then reframe technique in the seminal work has been directly adapted in the operationalization of the manipulated variable here. So it has been operationalized well. What is even more worthy of praise is the way the dependent variable has been operationalized. So the way the compliance to the request has been measured in this study, because actually adding the box of candy in the cart has been taken as the dependent variable, and not simply saying that yes, I will buy the candy, or no, I will not buy the candy. Because people say a lot of things, they even commit to a lot of things, but actually whether they end up doing the behavior is always questionable. So actually, will they buy the candy or not? When a participant in this study, when a shopper put in the candy into his cart, he did not know that he was being deceived. He felt he's really buying the candy when he put it into the shopping cart. So that was as good as actually buying the candy, actually making a payment for it. So definitely this way of measuring the dependent variable was excellent, because it showed not only a verbal commitment to buying the candy, but actual sales were seen in the case of this dependent variable. So the operationalization of the dependent variable here is commendable. In terms of the experimental design, definitely independent groups design was necessitated. in the present experiment, the use of independent variable design. Many times they ask you in the paper, should another design have been used instead, or why was this design better than another? So let's consider, what if a repeated measures design was used instead of independent groups design? What if the same participants were first made a request to buy the candy directly, and then made a request to buy the candy using the DTR technique, or the other way around, but the same participants exposed to both levels of the manipulated variable? What would happen in that case? Do you think that would be an ideal format? Definitely not, because again, what we generally know about the limitations of the repeated measures design, we have to apply it to this context. Participants who would first be made a direct request to buy a candy and then be made the same request using the DTR technique, they would definitely be confused. Definitely the effect of already having heard the request would bring them an automatic cognitive closure in the second instance. Or how I can put it is, once they had heard that the candy was for €1, sorry, €1, and then after that they were told that in another instance, say after 5 minutes, they would be approached with something else and told, oh, will you buy this for 100 euro cents? Immediately in their mind they would know it is for €1, because they've already heard the direct request first. So here the direct request was a part of the disrupt then reframe technique as well, and it is overlapping because of that. So there's no chance that we can use both type of requests with the same participant, because hearing one or the other message would automatically give the person an idea of what the request was being made to that person the second time. Okay, so in this case there was no possibility of using a repeated measures design, because exposure to either one level of the independent variable would confound the way the person would perceive the second level of the independent variable. So having been made a request directly would interfere with the second time a request was made using the DTR technique. Okay, so that is why independent groups design was suitable. Also, practically speaking, if someone is buying something in a shopping mall, asking him to buy the same things again and again is not going to lead to success. How much ever he wants to buy, how much ever quantity of candy he wants to buy, he'll buy it for the first time. He's not going to come up for the same things again and again. So repeated measures design was an impossibility in this case. Independent groups design was suitable. The shoppers were not randomly selected, but definitely they were just picked up from the normal crowd which was there. There was no special consideration while picking up these shoppers to be put into either the DTR condition or the direct request condition. So then we can expect to a fair extent that they represented typical shoppers in a shopping environment. So then definitely using the independent groups design gave a good picture, a good estimate of whether the DTR technique is influential or not, because the groups were comparable. That's what I'm trying to say, because they were selected from normal representative shoppers and without any special deliberation or consideration they were exposed to different requests. So we can expect that the results that have come out are because of the use of the DTR technique and not because of the individual characteristics of the people. So we do not really need a repeated measures design to control for their individual characteristics. So again, the choice of design is good. The independent groups design. In terms of sample and sampling technique, it's a very good sample. It's a very realistic sample, definitely generalizable, because these are typical shoppers we find in a supermarket. Again, these were those people shopping at around Christmas time, and the offer was related to Christmas sales. No doubt we would like to increase the generalizability by including a more diverse sample, or bringing up an offer in a non-season time also, and checking whether DTR works when there is no season around, where there is no Christmas. We definitely want to extend our findings that way, but that does not pose a problem with the generalizability of the sample here. It just tells us that the sample generalizability is limited, which is always going to be the case. So increasing generalizability or the scope of generalizability is always desirable, but that does not lessen or the generalizability of the present sample. It just restricts it. It does not put a question mark on the generalizability. So yes, the shoppers were pretty typical of those found around the Christmas season in supermarkets. So to that extent, definitely we can generalize the results, and we can expect that those shoppers who are normally in any supermarket, because the supermarket was also a typical one, nothing special about the supermarket. So we can expect from the results that around the shopping season, if we choose to sell a box of candy in any supermarket, and definitely at that time people with whom we'll use a DTR technique are more likely to buy the candy. Okay, after this we see sample was convenient. Definitely not very good in terms of generalizability. A convenient sample is not always good. It's always desirable to have more supermarkets included, more and then some sort of random selection of a sample from all these included supermarkets. So that is definitely desirable. Also within supermarkets, having some method of random selection is suitable rather than having a convenient sample. Nevertheless, I would not say that this has been a very big concern or a very had too much potential for confounding the results. Like I told you, the shoppers were pretty representative of typical shoppers in supermarket. Nonetheless, convenience technique does restrict generalizability in case there was something peculiar to this sample, which would not be the case with random sample. Always a random sample is better. In that case, results are restricted in terms of generalizability. This is something we can just note. It's not a major issue here. Data analysis, we are not in a position to comment. We are in high school, so we don't comment whether logistic regression had been used or not. So our evaluation of every element of the study should be limited up to the sampling technique which was used. Okay. Also, one area is ethical issues, which they mention in the description itself. So coming to ethical issues in this study, there was definitely deception. There's no denying that deception has been used in this study, but it was acceptable. There was no such deception that resulted in psychological harm or physical harm on the participants, not even for the short run, let alone for the long run. So if someone has been deceived into putting a box of candy into his cart, it is not going to cause him so much discomfort or so much stress that it warrants some critique of the ethical position adopted by the researchers. So ethics, we can say, were pretty much in place. There is no special mention in the report of, definitely there was no informed consent because it was a field experiment. So by definition there's no informed consent in a field experiment, but there's no mention of debriefing or counseling of any kind, so we don't know about those things. But apparently when we read the report and we see the nature of the experiment, there is no ethical concern that we expect from this experiment. Okay, this one I have done the evaluation in quite a bit of detail because it was the first study. Let's come now to the second study. Okay, this was for the second hypothesis. We should just revise the second hypothesis before entering into this study. The researchers also wanted to showcase that the DTR technique is going to be more successful with people high on the need for cognitive closure. So this whole second experiment was done keeping this aim in mind. So in the second experiment, the general paradigm or procedure was that researchers requested some students on a university campus to pay a small membership fee for becoming a part of a student interest group which was working on improving academics for students and some measures for students and for improving the things done for students on the campus, the availability of facilities for the students on the campus. They were told, the students were told there was such a group, an interest group working for them, and they were asked whether they would pay a small fee for becoming a part of that group. So this was the general idea of the experiment. Some of them were made this request to join the group and to make that fee payment using the DTR. Some were directly requested to make that payment. It was a field experiment again. We would expect to find students in the university campus, and student interest groups are of relevance to them, so that is where the experiment was conducted. And it was expected that students who were having high need for closure were the ones who would be more likely to pay the membership fee if they were approached using the DTR technique. Again, manipulation, directly borrowing from the first experiment. It was in terms of how the request was phrased. So some students on the campus were asked whether they would pay 300 euro cents to become a part of the student interest group, and then after 2 seconds the request was reframed and they were asked whether they would pay 3 euros to become a part of the student group. Another set of participants, students, were just asked whether they would, directly they were asked whether they would become a part of the student interest group by paying a fee of 3 euros. Here there are two measured variables. Actually, one of the variables has been measured, but do not confuse measured and independent variable. Sometimes an independent variable could be acquired by measurement rather than manipulation, and a good example we see here. Here we needed to somehow know about the NFCC of participants. Now NFCC is something you cannot manipulate, it's a part of the personality of the persons. You can measure it, you can check which participants had a high NFCC and which did not, but you cannot make participants have a high or a low NFCC for the sake of a study, right? So that is what was done in this research. Though NFCC was measured as a variable, but it was an independent variable, keep that in mind. So in this study there were two independent variables. The main one was the way the request was phrased, either in DTR terms or whether a direct request was made, and the second variable was whether the participant was high on NFCC or low on NFCC. This was also an independent variable, but it was measured because it was existent in the participant. It was a personality characteristic. How this was measured? Using a Hlauten and Ghréval scale of 2000. These researchers had made a scale for measuring NFCC. Given that this was a field experiment, the researchers noted they did not have the chance to measure NFCC using a full-fledged 42 item scale, because they could not expect participants who had not actually been requested to be a part of their study, who had just been recruited naturally on the field, to complete such an extensive measure and give them. They could not expect this, and they did not. So they used a shortened NFCC scale, which was prepared by Hlauten and Ghréval. It just consisted of 20 items. So 20 item scale they were requested to complete after the whole manipulation had been done with them, after they had been exposed to the first variable. So after they had either been directly requested or requested using DTR to join that student interest group, then they were requested to complete this 20 item questionnaire quickly. Why this was done also, it's a good point for the strength of the study, because they did not want that the completion of this scale somehow should influence whether they agreed, not create demand characteristics. So the completion of the scale should not influence whether they agreed to pay the fee for membership or not. So it was given later. Okay, coming to the NFCC, it was measured between participants. So some of them turned out to be high on NFCC, some turned out to be low. The scale consisted of 20 items, but later the researchers factor analyzed it because it was not very reliable, and they came down to 6 items. Okay, so in case you read somewhere there were 6 items and you get confused, participants answered 20 items, but because all the items were not necessary in indicating how much of NFCC they had, the items were reduced to 6 items. Okay, that's a little technical issue. And then in terms of measurement of the dependent variable, whether the payment was actually done or not by participants. Again, a very good dependent variable. Participants were made to pay from their real money. If they agreed to the request here, they actually paid, and the payment was accepted by the researchers. So they actually ended up paying $3. Those who agreed to pay the fee for the interest group, and actually the researchers accepted that payment. So this was the operationally how the dependent variable was taken. Compliance to request here was operationalized as payment of tuition fee done by participants, and use of DTR technique was operationalized as the phrasing of the request as in the previous experiment, so I won't explain it again. And possession of NFCC or having high or low NFCC was operationalized as scores on the Hlauten and Ghréval scale. Okay, in terms of experimental design, this was a random groups design. This was not simply independent groups design. Here it has been mentioned that participants were randomly allocated either to the DTR technique or to the direct request technique. How randomization was done is not clear, but obviously once a participant came in using some, so once a participant is stopped on the campus, once he's been stopped, now whether to give him the DTR request or to give him a direct request was determined on basis of some random number table or random number generator which the researchers had. So just to go through it quickly, supposing this is participant number 8 who has come to me. This is the 8th person who's come to me on the university to listen to my request. I will look at a random numbers table and decide whether he should be put into the DTR condition or the direct request condition. So this was a random group design, and independent groups design randomly allocated or randomly assigned participants. In terms of sample and sampling technique, 155 students in the University of Twente campus in Netherlands were recruited for this study. Again, the male-female ratio is given, but it had no bearing on the findings. As the researchers mentioned, they even included it in as a part of their regression predictors, but they found the gender had no impact on the results of the experiment, so they did not consider it any further. Again, the sample was one of convenience. Whoever came on the campus, listened to the request, that person was taken to be a participant. In terms of the apparatus used, you have mentioned it separately because they do ask you in the paper, and you should know which scales, if any, have been used. So here there was a standardized scale, the 𝗧𝗨𝗜𝗍𝗟𝗏 scale, so you should know 20 item standardized scale was used for measurement. In terms of data analysis, again logistic regression was performed because dependent variable was either making the payment or not making the payment. So again dichotomous. NFCC was included as a continuous predictor, as they mentioned, but then they also say they use the median split. So anyways, those are technical details. But here we had logistic regression with 2 independent variables and 1 dependent variable. We are more interested in the results, so let's come down to that. Overall, 22%. So among all these 155 participants, 22% of them did make the payment of $3 to become a part of the student interest group. Now coming down to the results by the independent variable in which we are interested. Considering overall, irrespective of the NFCC of the participants, overall in these 155, those who were made the request using a DTR technique, 30% of them actually paid the $3 for becoming a part of the student interest group, while only 12% who were requested directly, what we call the reframe only technique, means they were directly asked, will you pay $3? 12% of them did pay the $3 and showed an interest in becoming a part in the student interest group. In terms of considering NFCC, so among these 155, those who had high NFCC, amongst them 43% who were made a direct request agreed and paid the $3, and 17% of those who were high on NFCC and made a direct request paid the $3. Among those who were low on NFCC in these 155 participants, 16% who were used, with whom the DTR technique was used, paid up the $3. Only 9% to whom a direct request was made paid the $3. What is important in noting in the results is that only in the first 2 cases we see a significant difference. In the last case we do not see a significant difference. So what this means is that the use of DTR overall, irrespective of whether participant has high NFCC or low NFCC, use of DTR in itself does increase compliance to requests significantly. So what was found in this sample would be found in any population of students in universities. That is what the results tell us. And in terms of high NFCC, people who have high NFCCs, they are significantly more likely to accept requests if they are made to them using the DTR technique, if direct requests are made to them. This is a significant result again. So again we would expect this with high NFCC students in university campuses beyond the sample of this present study as well. But when it comes to low NFCC, the results were not significant. So if people do not have a high need for cognitive closure, if they don't have much of a need for cognitive closure, in that case it doesn't matter whether we use the DTR technique to request them or we use a direct request to technique them. That has no bearing. The technique we use to make requests with them has no bearing on whether they will comply to the request or not. Okay, so those results were not significant. I will evaluate the elements of this study quickly because the evaluation is very similar to that of the last study. The use of a field experiment was a very good option because definitely calling students to laboratory and then getting them to comply to some requests, it's much better to see if they would really comply to some requests if they believe that these are actual requests being made to them. And student interest groups are very relevant. Again, I will see this in detail when we evaluate the research method used. The operationalization of the variables was excellent. NFCC was measured using a standardized scale, which is very desirable. The requests of DTR and direct requests were again made according to the seminal work done in DTR. Again, a thumbs up there. And the operationalization of the dependent variable was also excellent because it was actually payment done. So that was very desirable. One thing worth noting here though is that again the researchers came down to using student participants. It would have been more desirable somehow if they studied the influence of NFCC on compliance with requests in a setting like the supermarket. Okay, so that was missing. Again, they came down to student requests, but at least these were not non-monetary requests, these were monetary requests. So payment is of deep concern to consumer psychologists. Their work involves having people make payments, having people make purchases, actually spend their money. So that element was definitely there in this study. Okay, so again, dependent variable was operationalized well, because it was not just a yes or no to join the student interest group, it was actual payment which was made. Experimental design was excellent. Independent groups, again, we cannot expect the same participants to be high and low on NFCC. We have to differentiate between these, and again DTR and direct request using with the same participants, each condition would interfere with the other. So there was a need for independent groups design, and randomization is always desirable to balance out the effects of other variables, other potential influences. So the use of random variables was random number tables was excellent choice. Sample and sampling technique, if we talk about it, definitely representative university students but confined to a single university. So there was much less desirable. Whether the results would generalize beyond the campus of this university or not became questionable. So the results were restricted to the campus of University of Twente, and again it was a convenience sample because whoever stopped to listen to the request was made a part of the study, and definitely if the researchers chose this university somehow, it was easy for them to access this university. In terms of the material used, standardized scale is an excellent choice of material. And ethical issues. Okay, ethical issues, here there was an ethical issue that participants had to actually pay. So there was some financial harm, we can say, which was done to participants. They had to end up paying $3 for being part of a student interest group which was hypothetical, which existed only for the sake of the research. So they were definitely deceived into paying their money. And this is something, yes, next time when I make a video I will look at ethical issues as well, so I'll discuss this further there. But for now, you think whether it is okay to take money from participants in this way, and instead of refunding or returning it to them, once they are told about the true purpose, they were debriefed in this case. It's been explicitly mentioned, so they were debriefed. Now, is it okay to take their money and donate it to charity as the researchers did? Or do you think their money should have been refunded to them? Again, we don't know whether they were asked and then the money was donated to charity, or they were offered to take back their money. So this is something for you to think from this lesson. I leave it to you as far as ethical concerns go. Is this acceptable according to you or not? Okay, let's come to study 3. This is slightly different because the technique used here is different, the research method. A laboratory experiment was employed here. Okay, so instead of field experiments which we saw in the first two cases, here we have a laboratory experiment. So in study 3, the paradigm or the general procedure of the experiment was students in a university were requested to agree with an increase in tuition fee which would improve the quality of their education. Now here researchers, if we revisit the third hypothesis, because the study was conducted to test this third hypothesis or the third aim, what was done, the third aim which had been proposed was to showcase that the use of DTR and its impact on high NFCC individuals into complying into requests is mediated by perceived ambiguity. So first, DTR impacts the amount of perceived ambiguity, and then it results in an agreement to comply to a request on the part of individuals who are high on NFCC. Complicated study, yes, no, not difficult to understand. Okay, so here the request was that of increasing tuition fee. Okay, it was a laboratory experiment. Participants were called into a controlled setting. They were shown videos here. In that video, there was a student. Actually, it was a theatre actor, but I think it was a student theatre actor. The students who were watching the video, the participants, they believed it was a student just like them, and he was advocating some measures to improve the quality of education for students, for which he said research was necessitated. There was need to undertake research to be able to improve quality of education for students, and so he recommended many measures, and he requested the students through his video to agree to a tuition fee increase of 75 euros or $75, I'm not sure, which was a sizable increase in the tuition fee. Now, what the researchers did, obviously they manipulated the way the request was presented. So the student in the video, for some participants he made a request using the DTR technique, for some participants he made a request using the direct request approach, the reframe only approach as we call it. And then it was checked whether the students agreed to the increase in tuition fee or not. Let's get into the details. It was a laboratory experiment. The hypothesis was that, okay, one more thing the researchers did, I needed to explain that. They broke down the disrupt and reframe technique. We have continuously been having a reframe only condition. We have been having it from experiment 1, which we call the direct request condition. Okay, so reframe only has always been there, disrupt and reframe has been there in all the experiments. They added one more condition, disrupt only condition. So they broke down the DTR technique into its first half as well, and they took the disrupt only condition, and thereby they created a third condition for this particular experiment. The first two experiments as concerned the use of DTR technique, they had only two conditions, either the use of DTR to make requests or the reframe only or the direct request. Here there was a third type of request as well, the disrupt only request. Why? Because the researchers were coming down to an explanation why the DTR works. So they needed to look at the independent variable very closely, which they were doing with this study. We'll see how it works out. So what is being said in the hypothesis is that disruption only would create so much ambiguity, would create so much confusion. That is, if participants are asked to pay in pennies instead of dollars, it would create so much confusion amongst them that they would become more likely to comply with the reframe request, because the reframe request would then solve out their confusion, would clarify their confusion. So how this works out is something we are going to see in the procedure. Okay, in terms of the measured and manipulated variables, here we have the phrasing of the request. So here we have the way the request was phrased at 3 levels now instead of 2 levels. So the independent variable has been manipulated at 3 levels. First is the typical disrupt and reframe level, in which participants were first told that were first requested to pay. I think it should be 7. I think I made a mistake here. Okay, here it wouldn't be 300 euro cents, it would be 7,500 euro cents. So either they were asked to pay 7,500 euro cents, please check in the study, I'm not very sure, 7,500 euro cents, and then told please pay $75. In another condition they were asked to pay the 7 euros directly, and in the third condition they were asked to pay 7,500 euro cents without any further clarification of what this amounted to. So there was no reframing, there was only disruption. And what was expected was ambiguity would be highest in the case of those who were given only the disrupted figure, the 7,500 pennies. So what we are having is, I'll just clarify because I've got very confused with the amount. Okay, there were 3 conditions created for this experiment. To one set of participants, we can say 1/3 of the participants, a request was made to agree to a tuition fee increase of 7,500 euro cents, which was then reframed and presented as 75 euros. To another set of participants, another 1/3 of participants, a direct request or a reframed request only was given of accepting a tuition fee increase of $75, and to a third group of participants only a disrupted request was presented, which was to agree to a tuition fee increase of 7,500 euro cents. Okay, so this was the independent or the manipulated variable and how it was presented. What all was measured in the study was a number of things. Again, NFCC was measured because that was also taken as one of the independent variables. So NFCC was measured using a full-fledged 42-item Webster and Krugnansky scale of 1994. This was a laboratory experiment, so participants had the time, they had committed themselves to the experiment, so they would agree to complete a full-fledged scale, and that was used because it's always more desirable than an abbreviated form of a scale. It gives more accurate results. It's more psychometrically sound. Okay, besides that, their perceived ambiguity was measured, which was the critical dependent variable of this study. So which of the 3 conditions, disrupt only, reframe only, or DTR, created the most ambiguity, made participants feel the most confused or most lack of clarity in the message that was measured. Besides that, what was the attitude of the students or the participants towards the tuition fee, that was measured. So what they thought about the tuition fee on a 9-point measure of 6 scales, this was measured, the attitude change. Then some behavioral measures were used. 2 behavioral measures. One was the agreement for making phone calls and persuade other students to agree to the tuition fee increase. That was taken as one behavioral measure, whether these participants would make phone calls to other students and request them to accept the €75 increase in the tuition fee as well. Another behavioral compliance measure which was taken was their willingness to vote for the tuition fee increase. So whether if a voting was done on the campus where the tuition fee would be increased, whether these participants were willing to make a positive vote in favor of that increase or not, that was also measured on a scale. So both these things were measured on scales. Here, because tuition fees are something that students do not pay directly, or we cannot expect a direct donation, they pay it at the end of a year, and parents pay the tuition fee for the most. So this is something we could have not asked students directly to pay the fee, so just take €75 from them. That was not possible. So other type of behavioral measures had been used. So these behavioral measures were making phone calls and giving votes. Okay, again, whether this was a good format of a research, this was a good paradigm to be selected, or something which would amount to actual payment should have been used, as in the case of field experiments, where the actual payments are easy to make in the laboratory, whether they should have been made, whether those type of behavioral measures would have been better, where we actually got participants to pay instead of just committing themselves to doing something towards payment. Think about all of this till we come to the next video of issues and debates. This is food for thought for you. Could there have been a better design of this experiment? Okay, the experimental design was that of random groups, independent groups. There are 3 different levels of the IV. The first IV, which is phrasing of the request, and a separate set of participants was exposed to each level. The scale NFCC, again, separate groups of people can't be both high and low on NFCC, so a different set of participants was found to be high on NFCC, a different set was found to be low. Sometimes it helps to make a tree diagram. I was not making it so far, but this one is particularly complicated. You have to do the work of making outlines and tree diagrams, but I'll just give you an indication of how you can make them. So when we have 2 independent variables, they interact with each other, it becomes easier to understand. For no other purpose, I want you to draw a diagram to understand the experimental design. So here we had 2 types of participants, those who were high on NFCC, those who were low on NFCC, right? Naturally, it's a personality trait. Some of us are naturally high on NFCC, some of us are naturally low. And then some of those high on NFCC happened to be selected for the disrupt only condition. Some happened to be selected for the disrupt then rephrase condition. Some got selected for the reframe only condition. Same was the case with low NFCC participants. So in the experiment, if you have to know how many groups were there, there were 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6. Okay, these were the 6 groups of the experiment, and so we have results separately for the 6 groups, and a lot of insight we get from looking at the results for all the 6 groups. So if you're really interested, it's a lot of results to consider during explanations. You can refer to the original paper and you will find all the results well tabulated for all the 6 groups in that paper. But this is how, and there are 4 measures. So results for 6 groups in terms of 4 measures: perceived ambiguity, attitude, and 2 behavioral compliance measures. So you can imagine how many results are there on that table. Okay, so the results are 3 into 2 into 4. Okay, but just because when you're understanding an experiment, you should understand it fully. So you should know that there were 6 groups in the experiment. Okay, the design used was random groups design. NFCC cannot be randomized, it's natural to participants. What was randomized was their position on the first variable, which was how the request was made to them. Disrupted only, reframed only, or disrupted and then reframed. That was manipulated across participants. Okay, Sample and sampling technique, 137 students were a part of this study from Indiana University. Why they agreed to be a part of the study was because it was a requirement for getting their course credits. Convenient sample, definitely. Very unrepresentative. Okay, and then coming to material or apparatus, most noteworthy in this study. See, there are a number of materials used in any study. Most noteworthy are the ones we need to take down in the outline. So the first was the 42-item Webster and Kruglanski NFCC scale, a highly standardized scale. Besides that, a video made by the male theatre major for getting students to comply to the requests. Why these materials are most important? Because they give you some point for evaluation of strengths and weaknesses. This is where experiments can falter. We can check whether they have used the correct type of primary materials or not. So they should be noted and you should be thinking about them while making your evaluation. Data were analyzed in terms of hierarchical regression, a very advanced technique, stepwise technique of looking at the impact of different variables on the dependent variables, which your dependent variables were also many, not just one. Okay, so a hierarchical regression analysis was made. That is all we need to know. I've presented here the chief results. I told you there are 3 into 2 into 4 results which you can look at in the paper. There's a very excellent summary table given in that paper which will make all results very clear. All the means are noted in that table because these were scales, these were point scales which the participants had answered. So all the means have been noted down in that study. The main results that we find are, for those high on NFCC, so those participants out of these 137, those who were high on NFCC, amongst them, those who were given disruption only, means those who were only asked for 7,500 euro cents increase in tuition fee, who were asked to accept that, among those and those who were high on NFCC, the perceived ambiguity was highest in all the 3 groups. Students who were asked to pay 7,500 euro cents as an increase in their tuition fee in the long run, and plus they were high on NFCC, they were the ones who really needed cognitive closure, who were not comfortable with having to think a lot without resolution. These were the ones who felt most confusion, we can say roughly, when they heard the message. They found it difficult to understand what was being requested, whether something acceptable was being requested of them or no, when they were asked to accept a tuition fee increase of 7,500 euro cents. They were really confused compared to all the groups. So compared to those who were low on NFCC, compared to those who were given the DTR request, compared to those who were given the direct request, compared to all the other 5 groups, this group was the most confused when they were given the message, the request. And those who were made a direct request and they were high on NFCC as well, but they were made a direct request, they showed the least ambiguity. They were not very confused amongst those who had high NFCC. So we can say in terms of 1, 2, 3. So for those, we are talking about those participants who had high NFCC. Amongst those who are only given a disrupted request, a break away from a traditional request, a confused request. So only the disrupted message, they were the most confused. They perceived the most amount of ambiguity. And then those who were high on NFCC, but they were given a disrupted, please give me 7,500 pennies, and then told, okay, give me 75 euros. Now they were the ones who were second in terms of how much ambiguity they perceived, while those who were given the direct request that please accept a fee increase of 75 euros, they were the least confused. They perceived the least amount of ambiguity. Then the next result, which is very important, was overall DTR successfully changed attitudes for those high on NFCC. Successfully changed attitudes means what? These people became more favorable towards the tuition fee increase. So those who are high on NFCC, plus a request was made to them in terms of disrupt and then reframe. So first they were asked to accept an increase in tuition fee of 7,500 euro cents, and then after 2 seconds asked to accept a tuition fee increase of 75 euros, and they had high NFCC. They showed a most favorable change in their attitude. They felt that it was good to ask for a tuition fee increase and increase the amount of research that students need to do to improve the quality of education. This group who were high on NFCC plus they were made a DTR request. They felt it was a good idea to pay the students 75 euros more so that they could conduct their research and improve the quality of education. Means are given in the bracket. All these are significant results. I won't discuss significance again, I've been discussing it. Means are there in the bracket. Mean 28.22, that attitude 6 scales 1 to 9. The scores of every participant were averaged in terms of attitude. So on an average in this group, high NFCC plus DTR, a mean of 28.22 was found. 28.22 favorable attitude. Roughly they had a score of 28.22 on how favorable the attitude was towards allowing students to increase a 75 euro fee and then conducting their research to improve quality of education. Similar results on behavioral compliance measures in the paper also, because so many results are there, they just say okay, similar results on behavioral compliance. But if we look at the table, we get the main results. In terms of willingness to donate time, how much time they would give to themselves, request other students to accept the tuition fee increase. Those who were high on NFCC and they were given the DTR type of request, they were the most willing to give their time, to donate their time to further these requests and to reach out these requests to other students as well. The mean of this was 2.39. If we look at their scale of behavioral compliance, this amounts to they were willing to give about 15 minutes. These students were willing to give on an average about 15 minutes to convince other students to accept the tuition fee increase as well. That is what we come to know from this result. One, they were high on NFCC, these students, plus they had been requested by DTR, first asked to accept an increase of 7,500 euro cents and then clarified that this was an increase of 75 euros. These students were willing to give 15 minutes when it came to, on an average 15 minutes when it came to requesting other students to accept the tuition fee hike as well. And in terms of the other behavioral measure, these students were also more likely to vote for high NFCC. So if a voting would be conducted on campus and students would be asked that will you vote and in favor of an increase in tuition fee, these students were much more likely to agree with students high on NFCC plus who had been requested using the DTR technique. Okay, let's quickly evaluate the elements of this experiment. In terms of the research method used, laboratory experiments are very desirable for the control they exert. So here the researchers did have control over measuring NFCC. Like we saw, they were able to get an accurate measurement of NFCC of the participants, which they were not able to do in field experiments. Besides that, they had control over how the requests were presented to students. They could show them full-fledged videos with proper introductions and everything. So that was very useful. They could also get participants to complete so many skills and measure their attitudes and behaviors separately, which was not possible in the case of field experiments. So a lot of advantage over field experiment, but with the compromise that the environment was very less realistic. In fact, where I noted the material and I pointed it out to you, using a video request, how realistic it is realistic to the extent nowadays a lot of people ask us by making videos to make donations to their charities and all. Definitely, but then is it as realistic as having someone come face to face with us and make a request? That is for you to think till I come up with the next video. So keep thinking about these things. For those things I'm going to elaborate on later. I'm not going to give you complete evaluations right now. In terms of the measured and manipulated variables, if we look at the the manipulated variable first, the phrasing of the request, very well operationalized, in fact broken down to disrupt only in this case, which proved to be useful to check how much ambiguity people perceived in the situations. In terms of measured variables, again standardized scales, all these scales which have been mentioned here were standardized and very well conceptualized as well. So good standardized questionnaires were used to measure the dependent variable, which really increases the psychometric properties. Again, we do come down to reliability and validity in the next video, but think about it, how it adds to reliability and validity use of standardized scales. Not difficult to answer. Okay, random groups design was used. Definitely, repeated measures design, for the same reason stated earlier, repeated measures design were not suitable to this experiment, so random groups was suitable. Sample and sampling technique, it was a sample of convenience, not a very good choice. Having students participate for course completion, these students tend to be very unrepresentative of the population, because those who come in for course completion credits are in a way forced to be a part of the experiment. So we could expect that about half or more of them would not agree, wasn't it for course requirements. So their motivation, authenticity and everything comes into question, and their representation is definitely not that of typical students. Okay. In terms of the strength has been good. If we look at the strength of the sample, the representation of gender, it has been good throughout all studies. 100 plus participants is a very good number for any study. So in the sense of strength or size of sample, generalizability is definitely not in question in any of these experiments. Materials were really good. Like I told you, artificiality of video, is it realistic, is it artificial to use a video? We'll come back to that later, think about it. Standardized scales, especially the NFCC scale which was used full-fledged, very very desirable, very useful, really adds to the validity and reliability, because using scales which are standardized just means that we can trust the results of the scale. They've been conceptualized correctly, they are valid. Study after study they have shown to really measure what they are designed to measure, which gives them validity, and they're definitely reliable, because study after study they've been successful in identifying those who are high on NFCC and those who are low. So they have been very good, consistent in identifying people, which was the purpose of this study as well. Ethical issues, there was definitely deception in this case as well, because students did believe that they were actually being asked for a tuition fee increase, but it was acceptable. Again, they didn't really do anything, they didn't even make calls or vote in reality. They just had to indicate whether they would vote and whether they would agree for the tuition fee increase. So nothing as such, they were not harmed financially, psychologically or physically in any way, so that those were not concerns of this study. Okay, and in terms of deception, think about demand characteristics. Since it was done in laboratory, do you think participants must have managed to guess why they were being shown certain type of videos? And if they did manage to guess, did it impact the way the results turned out in this study? So look at the results. When you consider such questions of demand characteristics, look at the results and think of demand characteristics. Would demand characteristics affect different groups differently? If so, why? And if they would not, then is there really some evidence for demand characteristics in the study? That is for you to think till the next video. Finally, we come to the conclusions of the study. What did they find of the study? Means through the 3 experiments, it's one study in totality. What they found through these experiments, that all their hypothesis was confirmed. So to summarize the findings, firstly, yes, use of DTR does increase sales in a commercial, non-student monetary environment. So yes, they established that. Yes, DTR works better for people who are high on NFCC. In fact, it does not seem to work at all for people low on NFCC. So it is successful provided people have a high need for cognitive closure. And yes, the way in which it works, or its mechanism of working, is that it increases perceived ambiguity, and upon resolution of this ambiguity, people who are high on NFCC, they become more likely to comply to a request. In the 3rd study, if you notice, perceived ambiguity did increase in the disrupt only condition, but in the rest, whether the people actually agreed to the tuition fee increase, whether they had a favorable attitude towards it, whether they were willing to vote for it, whether they were willing to request others for it, that was not only by disruption, that was with disruption and then reframing. So the reframing part is very important to get high NFCC people to comply. Okay, so disruption only creates ambiguity, then the reframing part is what convinces the person to comply. That was clearly seen in the 3rd study. So the researchers, we can conclude that they successfully showed that DTR cannot simply be expected to work out in commercial context. It depends on whether people are having the need for cognitive closure, and they also showed how it works. It works because it plays around with the ambiguity of the message. First it increases ambiguity and then it resolves the ambiguity that people experience. It's a trick, it's a persuasion tactic. All persuasion tactics are tricks, but they work out to increase sales, which we desire. One more conclusion which is seen in this study, and which again I will discuss in the next video in detail, but I'm leaving it to you for thinking, and also because this conclusion is important. It has to do with the application of the findings, where these findings can be applied in everyday life. There's a need found to shift to omega strategies from alpha strategies. Alpha strategies in consumer psychology are simply those which increase a person's chances of complying with the request by persuading him. So the foot in the dodo in the face type of techniques. But omega techniques are those which reduce the resistance that consumers have. Nowadays we say consumers are wise, they're smart. They know that they are going to be deceived. They know they are going to be manipulated. So omega techniques are those which reduce this resistance which they have towards persuasion, and then persuade them to comply to some request to buy certain products. So there a need has been felt since the smart consumer has come in to increase the number of omega techniques which are there, such as DTR, to be used. This is one conclusion they came down to, that DTR can be very useful as an omega technique of persuasion. We'll talk about this more when we look at the applicability of the findings, which we have to do in the next video. Now I will quickly summarize what we have seen in this research, which I expect you to revise this summary before we come to the next video. So I'm presenting a summary to you. This study by Kardes et al. Was about investigating the disrupt and reframe technique, as it would help to increase the sales of products in commercial settings such as supermarkets. The researchers, besides showing this main aim of their study, which was that DTR can be used to increase sales, they also wanted to show that DTR works selectively with NFCC individuals, people who need cognitive closure, and they also wanted to show that the way it works is by increasing the ambiguity that NFCC people feel and then resolving the ambiguity for them. So for this end, they conducted 3 studies. In the first study, they showed that DTR is useful in a supermarket setting to get people to buy products as against direct requests towards them for buying the products using traditional scripts, using traditional way of making requests. In study 2, they did show that DTR works selectively with high NFCC individuals. It's not successful with people low on NFCC. This they showed, but not in a supermarket context. They showed it in terms of payments to be made on a campus for a student interest group. So using that setting, again using a field experiment like in the first study, they managed to show that high NFCC is a precondition for DTR to work out in complying to a request. And in study 3, what they showed was that the way DTR works is increasing the ambiguity that people feel in a situation and then resolving the ambiguity for them. They also showcased in this study that DTR changes the attitudes, the way people think about a request, as also it changes the outward behavior, the willingness to comply with the request. So it works at all levels. That also they established, and definitely the first 2 studies, the findings that shown, those were replicated in this third study. So this third study was not only in the way of establishing why DTR works, but it also gave supporting evidence, or it strengthened the results of the first 2 studies, because it showed the same findings again, that DTR does work, and it does work in the case of people having high NFCC. Okay, so keep revising the study until the next class, in which I will discuss the issues and debates, the evaluation of the research method, and some sample questions I'll look into from this study. So goodbye and keep studying.